This afternoon, I will try with you to map the understanding and the responses of the European churches to the mission among the Roma. And so much has been happening and is happening, but it's all happening in different small places by individual people, and hardly any studies have been undertaken to bring it out. So I can rather this afternoon, like this morning, rely on more general European-wide documents and information, and not so much deal with some of the smaller initiatives, which are really the important ones. In Hungarian, in her welcome speech on a conference on the role of churches in the social inclusion of Roma, Lívia Járóka, the first member of the European Parliament of Roma origin background, appreciated the unique community building activities the Hungarian and the other traditional churches pursue. She said in her welcome speech, "First and foremost, the poorest people suffer of precarious living conditions, and they are the ones that mostly need the message of love and respect of human dignity against the phenomenon of social inclusion. However, the poverty affecting the majority of Roma is a serious barrier in community building. Many respectable examples demonstrate that traditional churches are able to cope with this dual challenge. They can simultaneously provide social support and spiritual care. They can help the poorest people in their earthly life and meanwhile proclaim the universal command of love and work with all their strength in the broadest layers of society to diminish the prejudices." So Lívia Járóka. It's remarkable that a European Member of Parliament, a Roma European Member of Parliament, calls on the churches to help with the Roma. And also remarkable, well, how she does it from really a Christian perspective. The main objective of my series of lectures is to explore images and identities of the Roma, to find out who they really are, and to get insight in the major challenges related to the Roma in the European context. And this afternoon we will look more into the responses of the European churches to the images they have. And also this afternoon I will try with you to understand the perspectives of European churches on mission among the Roma. And tonight I will try to explore what a missiological perspective could offer. The wall and the door. You have all received the invitation for this lecture, haven't you? And you have seen the wall and the door image. Well, this morning I already mentioned how, that probably this door may belong to one of the European churches who unfortunately have played an active role in the exclusion of the Roma. When you take a closer look at your invitation and at this picture, you will see that this door has a key. And I'm convinced that the European churches do have access to the key to unlock this door, but it seems that this key is lost. And these lectures, I'm trying with you to try to find the key to unlock. And in doing so, I will draw on missiological principles established by Andrew Walls in an attempt to unlock the door and gain a new perspective. This morning I've referred several times to the changes of 1989 due to the fall of the Berlin Wall. With regard to the Roma, it should be stated that due to these changes, new walls were erected, walls of exclusion. In this presentation, so I will continue my search for this key. This morning I mentioned some of the major challenges we face in Europe related to the Roma, the challenges of poverty, unemployment and housing, the vicious circle of poverty and the lack and the need of education. It's important what Ian Hancock said with regard to the fact that there is not just a gypsy problem. He did an internet search a few years ago on the words gypsy problem and found 22,000 hits. But he says it's not simply a gypsy problem. The problem from the perspective of the non-Roma world is, he says, that they see us, and he speaks also from a Roma perspective, being a Roma himself, see us as the eternal outsiders, not wanting to fit in, yet wanting what it has, living by deception and theft, taking everything while contributing nothing except perhaps entertainment, loud, dirty, and leaving a mess behind besides. From the perspective of the Roma, he says, our overwhelming problem is with racism. This directly underlies and supports the problem that it holds up those of poverty, those of employment, schooling, healthcare and housing, and in human rights and civil rights. So there are in fact two problems, and that is very important to understand. We cannot just deal with the one, but we need to deal with the other as well. Well, how have churches responded to the existing or acted upon the images which exist among them? And I will focus more on, a little bit on the Catholic Church, or mainly on the Catholic Church, and because it's simply that more research has been done among them. In a general observation is that the Roma have lived in Christian Europe for almost 500 centuries. It's the Bulgarian missiologist Miroslav Atanasov who in 2008 defended a groundbreaking doctoral study titled Gypsy Pentecostals, the growth of the Pentecostal movement among the Roma in Bulgaria and its revitalization of their communities. He reminds us that the historical relation between the Roma and Christianity is remarkable. Although the Roma have lived among Christians for centuries, the Roma have always been marginalized and overlooked by them. Among the European Roma, we find Catholics, Orthodox, Protestants and Muslims because in general they join the religion of the majority in a particular region. It's the Roman Catholic Church which has probably since the 1960s got an increased interest in dealing with the Roma. In 1965, a group of about 2,000 gypsies arrived from all over Europe on a pilgrimage to Rome. Their goal was to ask the Pope for official protection for their nomadic life. Gernot Haupt, an Austrian Romologist, reminds us that there is one sentence that is quoted in every document since. And I quote, "You are," so this is what the Pope said and how he greeted them. "You are not at the margins of the church, you are, in a certain sense, in the center. You are at the heart of the church," unquote. But, Haupt reminds us, it is a quotation taken out of context. The full greeting reads, "Best greetings to you, eternal pilgrims, to you, voluntary fugitives, to you who are always on the run. Best greetings to you who have chosen your little tribe, your caravan as your separated and secret world, to you who look at the world with distrust and are looked at with distrust from all, to you who wanted to be foreigners everywhere and forever." That is quite a different way. According to Haupt, this is what it said in the original Italian text. A few years later, Pope Paul VI established the Pontifical Council for the Pastoral Care of Migrants and Itinerant People. The purpose of the council was to study people on the move, to evangelize them and provide them with appropriate spiritual shepherding. Under the auspices of this council, the Department of Pastoral Care for Gypsies was situated, which organized several world congresses. The first pastoral letter for nomadic people in 1999 warns for the dangers of sects. I quote, "Many gypsies, because they lack sufficient religious instruction, are often exposed to pressure by religious sects, which push them to abandon the Catholic Church and abjure their faith. Hence the need for solid religious formation, education, and above all, these brothers and sisters of ours must be helped to realize their dignity and their responsibilities." The document calls our attention for the positive characteristics of the gypsy world, such as fraternal and generous hospitality, a deep sense of solidarity, strong attachment to the faith, and the religious traditions of their ancestors. It also emphasizes that the participation of the gypsies in society should be strengthened. I quote, "It will be necessary to set up structures to guarantee the continuity of the process of furthering gypsy participation in society for their identity by friendly dialogue and reciprocal help, also material." Well, then a few years later, in 2003, a congress took place in Budapest, and a number of principles were established how work among the Roma should take place. Practical advice was given. And it was also realized that you can only deal with work among the Roma if you do it together with other churches in a ecumenical cooperation. It's a few years later, an important document was issued in 2006 after many years of preparation. Its document is called the Guidelines for the Pastoral Care of the Gypsies, and it deals, among others, with the issue of how to overcome suspicion, referring to what happened in the past. I quote, "History matters, and as a consequence of all the wrongs they have suffered, the gypsy population has remained suspicious of any initiative that tries to penetrate its world. Overcoming this initial attitude may come about only through concrete manifestations of solidarity, also by sharing its life." This document was announced in the German press under the headline, "Pope asks Sinti and Roma," that's the German expression for the Roma, "for forgiveness." But Jan Opela expresses his disappointment as finally the guidelines were published, offering a pastoral theological foundation for the pastoral care of the gypsies. With regard to dealing with the past, Opela considers it of much more importance that at the day of forgiveness of the public intercession prayer was ministered in 2000 in the presence of Pope John Paul II by Stefan Fomino Cardinal Hamao from Japan, who is the president of this Pontifical Council for the Pastoral Care for Migrants and Itinerant People. And this Japanese chairman of this committee, he prayed at this public prayer, at this public occasion, "Let the Christians look up to Jesus, who is our Lord and our peace. Give that they can regret what they have done wrong in word and deed. Often they have let themselves to be led by pride and hatred, by the will to dominate others, by the hostility to the adherents of other religions and to those groups in society that are weaker than they, like the migrants and the gypsies." The Pope responded in his prayer of forgiveness, I quote, "They have violated the rights of tribes and people and scorned their cultures and religious traditions. Extend us your patience and your mercy, forgive us. Therefore we pray through Christ our Lord." According to Opela, this prayer is very remarkable. Such a prayer is prayed for the sisters and brothers in the faith since a large percentage of the Roma and Sinti do have affinity with Christianity or were baptized or are baptized in the Catholic Church. It took the Church almost 500 years to express such a confession of guilt, but Opiela says, what is 500 years in view of a history of 2,000 years? It's also talking about repentance of the European churches. It took place in Norway in 2000, so there is small initiatives of repentance are taking place, which I think is very important. Well, this document, this Catholic document, also emphasizes the importance of ecumenical and inter-religious dialogue. The second church we will take a look at how they have responded to the Roma, or rather it is a church body, is the Conference of European Churches. As we try to get an insight in how various European churches have responded and acted upon the images dominating in their midst, we will first take a closer look at the Church's Commission for Migrants in Europe of the Conference of European Churches, which is one of the major church bodies in Europe. They organized a conference in 2001 with the theme Living Community, Equal Opportunities and Overcoming Discrimination. With regard to making living in community possible, churches in Europe are, in the report issued after the conference, are called upon recognizing that they have been part of the history of the Roma, as the Roma have had to face neglect, harassment, persecution and murder. For true dialogue to be possible, the document says, European people, including the churches and councils of churches, I quote, need to recognize what they and we did wrong, did to wrong the Roma in the past and express that repentance for wrongs in the past. The churches are all encouraged to call upon governments and authorities to lobby that the European Union strategy be implemented. And that is very interesting in this document. Yes, there is a foundation, a biblical foundation. We have to deal with the Roma because we are all created after the image of God. But it seems that the churches are not taking responsibility themselves. They rather are of the opinion the European Union is responsible, and we simply join that strategy and try to do some lobbying. There is a slight shift in emphasis some 10 years later. I spoke about it this morning, that in 2011, a European framework for the Roma inclusion was adopted, and the European churches were requested to contribute with a document to see what their particular responsibility could be. And again, we do see that they emphasize again, yes, it's the responsibility of the European Union, and we are willing to help. We have good connections and good resources at a local level for helping you in doing what you would like to do. It's interesting if we look at the strategy of the European Union in this in the document, which I would call is this European framework document. The aim of the European Union strategy is foremost to create a better, is an economical perspective, to raise the level, the standards of living of the Roma in the eastern part of Europe, so that it is not necessary that they will move to the west and being expelled and have to go back. So it is rather an economical motive. But I discovered that the document on the framework has two versions. It has an official version which was adopted a year ago, and it has this sole economic perspective. But I think they realized this is probably too not well worded enough. So now, in the revised version, they said, well, we have also a moral responsibility. But what is interesting that, again, the European churches, by way of this, the Conference of European Churches, they adhere of this strategy and offer their support because of their good connections. But what I find striking is the way how the Hungarian government has reacted. The minister in Hungary responsible for the Roma work till recently is the Reformed pastor Zoltán Balogh. And you can really tell that he has used his kind of influence to bring in a Christian perspective in this official government document. And he calls upon, states in 2-3 pages, how the Hungarian government could contribute to the work among the Roma. And he calls upon the special motivation out of which the churches can deal with the Roma, also their unique possibilities of working towards changing the mindset of the majority population. He also sees a special role for the churches as a mediatory role. So it seems that the Hungarian government has taken the maximum possibility using the offered framework to bring in their Christian identity. But it's interesting enough, not brought in by the churches, but brought in from the side of the government. So there is now, I think, the great challenge for the churches how to respond. They can either respond that, okay, we continue to join the projects of the European Union, or we think through, and that I think is an important task for the churches, to think through how to respond to this offer by the Hungarian government, how to respond in a more theological way and to bring in their own Christian identity. In the remainder of my talk, I will deal with probably a part of what's happening among the Roma, which is not so familiar with you. It's about a revival among the Roma in France. A significant revival started in the 1950s in France through the ministry of Clément Le Cossec. In September 2010, the Christian Science Monitor had a headline, "In France, evangelical gypsy groups shake up the immigration debate." At the same time of the collective expulsions of Roma, which were all over in Europe on the headlines, the collective expulsions of the Roma out of France back to Romania in August, 26,000 evangelical gypsies gathered in the heart of France to sing, give testimonies and read the Bible. And the article said the gypsy stereotypes are not valid anymore. According to recent statistics, out of the 425,000 French gypsies, 145 joined the evangelical movement. Other sources mention even 200,000 out of the 500,000. The most important organization is the organization called Vie et Lumière, Light, Life and Light, to which about 200 evangelical Roma churches belong. Another is the organization called Centre Missionnaire Évangélique de Rome International, is the Evangelical Center for Mission of the Roma, both established by Clément Le Cossec. Marie Bidet characterizes these gypsies in her doctoral thesis as, "They are serious, respectable, they vote, they won't want to burn cars, they want everyone living in peace." That's opposite from the traditional inmate. It can be underlined that they succeed in their approach. After Le Cossec, he was a fisherman, himself not a gypsy. He was in 1952 instrumental in the healing of a gypsy woman. And then the gypsies asked him to establish a Bible school for them. And he literally became the Jew a Jew and the Greek a Greek and joined them in their caravans and on the road taught them the Bible. And since in France the majority of the Roma are still traveling nomads. In a fascinating interview in 1996, shortly before his death, and you can find this interview on the internet and it's worthwhile reading, he characterizes his ministry as, I quote, "Not a minute was it a question of lecturing them with morals, telling them they should not drink, not lie, not steal, or soothsay anymore. I knew that by receiving the message of Christ, everything would change in their lives." In the middle of the 1990s, Le Cossec counted 6,000 gypsy preachers all over Europe. 6,000. The evangelical gypsy movement spread out of France over the whole world. Currently, more than 2 million believers belong to this movement in 44 countries. Marc Bourdingon, an anthropologist of Providence University, characterizes the work of Le Cossec, I quote, "Le Cossec's approach paradoxically enabled gypsies to keep their identity through the faith, Christianity, that asserts what he calls a universal character." More than 1,000 gypsy congregations were established in Spain, and they consider as their mission tasks also to evangelize among the non-Roma. I heard that in Spain there are many congregations who have gypsy pastors with Spanish church members. Elsewhere, they consider, Thomas Acton, a professor of Romology at Greenwich University, said to be, I quote, "deeply impressed by Roma Christians' ability to find joy in their faith while living on a continent that has rejected their people for centuries. I think the Romani witness that is emerging as it gets written down and people understand what is going on will be seen as a moment in world religion." Elsewhere, Acton states, I quote, "The Gypsy Evangelical Church differs from previous missions in that it is, in the best sense, profoundly nativistic. It does not teach its converts to be ashamed of being a Romani. On the contrary, it tells them that they can be better gypsies for being Christians and better Christians for being gypsies. For unlike the poor non-gypsies who are tied down to one place by their houses, the gypsies can carry his witness for Christ wherever he wanders." Le Cossec is clear about the role of evangelical, that the role of an evangelical mission organization is not just to bring material help, as humanitarian organizations do, but that it can bring a plus, Christ. And I quote, it's a longer quote, "I guess you have to limit yourself only to the announcement of Jesus Christ. What about follow-up work?" That's the question which was asked him. "We first have to preach Christ," he says, "according to the apostles' formula. It has always been a priority for me. And what we do in the framework of the Gypsy Evangelical Mission is not only bringing a material help, what a lot of humanitarian organizations do, each in their sector and with competence. We bring a plus, Christ himself. We do not lose sight in that our first goal is to speak of Christ, the living bread come down from heaven. We have to understand that there is no possible salvation for man out of Christ. He has come to earth, he has lived as a poor, he has brought the good news of salvation by grace. And if we do not make by ourselves the experience of conversion, how could we communicate to others the spiritual realities the gospel supports and the testimony which goes with it? It is essential, he says, to assure the doctrinal basis of a true life of faith. Le Cossec established a separate organization for dealing with the social dimension of mission work. Interesting is that this Le Cossec did not join the Pentecostal Church. They are closely related to the Pentecostal Church, but recently they joined the French Protestant Federation. So they are not like what we would call general Pentecostals, but are very closely cooperating with the ecumenical movement. My time, I think I will skip a part and do that, take that up this afternoon. If we try to summarize the different perspectives, we first of all have to can discern the human development perspective. As we analyze and compare the European Church's responses perspective to what is by some perceived as a gypsy problem, we find the following three. First is the following four: the human development perspective, the human rights perspective, the anti-gypsyism perspective, and the missiological perspective. The human development perspective is based on or a response to an image that combines a way of life with low socio-economic and social status. We have seen that the primary criteria for defining the group is not its origin, but a nomadic way of life, as we have often seen a forced nomadic way of life. The images belonging to this group are usually portrayed as the majority being a criminal underclass, as impoverished, unproductive vagrants and parasites. We have observed that images of this category are almost always negative, I quote, creating a sense of conflict, mistrust and antagonism between the settled and the nomadic societies. In 2001, a first comprehensive quantitative survey of the Roma minorities in Central Eastern Europe was undertaken by the United Nations Development Programme and the International Labour Organization. The survey looked at Roma realities from a human development perspective. The application of a human development paradigm to marginalized minorities is conceived as a new framework for Roma issues. Although the main focus is on human development, it is stated that it does not include a human rights perspective as well. In the same year, as we have seen, the Conference of European Churches had their consultation and expressed their full support for this strategy of the European Union. This perspective reminds us of what Kwame Bediako description of the missionary enterprise in Africa as being part of a benevolent Western movement to elevate the conditions of African peoples, according to which Christianity was spread with a Western cultural package. It is no surprise that the European churches took over this approach, as it was so closely related to their development work, for instance in Africa, and they had experience with that paradigm. The Roma scholar Thomas Acton severely criticizes this approach, as he is of the opinion that the research on which this document was based was exclusively and almost singling out only the poor Roman people, because in their definition of this document of the United Nations, they defined a gypsy who is socially poor. So they singled out already in the beginning only the poor people. And Thomas Acton says this is not giving a really fair treatment of all the Roma. And he regrets it that this strategy does not address the key issue of exclusion among the majority population and the majority society. After a decade of human development approach, a general consensus in Europe seems to occur in the churches and in the society that money is not a solution to the problem. As the projects are aimed at the Roma community, it creates rather a new wall of division and jealousy with the majority society, rather than serving the purpose of bringing the Roma at the economic standard of living to prevent them to en masse move to the western part of Europe. So they even speak about the gypsy industry nowadays. So this approach is what I would call reductionist, in that it focuses on alleviating one aspect of the problem, poverty, but not dealing with the root of the problem, the walls of exclusion. It does not address the majority society's attitude of anti-gypsyism. The second perspective we can discern is the human rights approach, the human rights perspective. Since the European Union and following the European Union strategy, the European churches in general realized the single focus on a human rights approach, on a human development approach does not suffice. A new strategy was emphasized based on another image of the Roma, not the Roma as the socially poor, but the one, an image of the Roma, that of the ethnic cultural minority. The European churches rightly emphasize the importance of equal opportunities. Everyone is allowed to enter the door, but they do not realize that the door is still locked and we are still looking for the key. The new EU framework for Roma inclusion includes this human rights approach, but it does still not use the full potential of the Christian identity of the European churches. Although, as we have seen the case of Hungary, it seems that more space is given to the churches, contributing with their own emphasis, or we should say the churches are more proactive in taking and using their own particular Christian identity. Probably the strongest argument against the European Church's strong focus on the human rights perspective is that it operates from a different framework of thought, a legal framework, and not from a theological framework. It is interesting that the responsibility to deal with the Roma issues seem to be still put on the shoulders of the EU, with the EU responsible for funding all the projects, even the ones which are executed by the churches. In this way, what is called the gypsy industry is continued, and thus the dynamics of competition and struggle for getting money is at the forefront, instead of true compassion and love, which is very cheap. Also, the great danger of short-term projects instead of sustainable long-term approaches is there. It should also be emphasized that the missionary calling of the churches does include caring for the poor and struggling against injustice, but it can never be the only focus. Again, we thus deal with a reductionist approach and should look for a more integrative, comprehensive and holistic way of mission to the Roma, which focuses on both the Roma and on dealing with changing the mindset of the majority society. The third perspective I briefly deal with is the anti-gypsyism perspective. I've long been thinking whether I should include this perspective, but I think it is important. In a number of churches, we have observed that the dominating image on the basis of which they act and respond is still that of racism. It will hardly ever be named that way, but it is hidden behind the other images. Still, I think it is important to dare to face this very sensitive issue. Otherwise, we cannot start to change the approaches. There is almost unanimous agreement on the fact that discriminating attitudes prevent the Roma to have access to education, employment and housing. And it's a huge theological and missiological challenge to deal theologically with this apartheid system. The fourth perspective is the missiological perspective, used by European churches in their mission work with the Roma. As we analyze how Andrew Wall's two principles of indigenization and the Pilgrim's principle function, we observe that the Roman Catholic documents do refer to these principles, and attempts are made in the Roman Church to this end. These principles, however, are strongest represented among the Pentecostal gypsy churches as they seek to translate the gospel to the Roma culture. More research is needed whether they are able to apply not only the indigenization principle, that is clear, but to what extent the Pilgrim's principle also is manifest. Haupt's criticism towards the Pentecostal churches that they create a new wall of separation with regard to the majority society and churches may be true, when the universalizing Pilgrim's principle is not emphasized enough. In other words, when the common denominator of the gospel is not strongly enough represented or emphasized in both the Roma churches and the non-Roma churches, and the Western or Roma Roma culture elements are the strongest, the sense of belonging to a worldwide Christian church is missing, or at least is weak. In summary, we have observed that the European churches have responded differently to the Roma, based on the different images they have. These different images lead to various responses and perspectives. We have seen they are all in itself important, but taken solely are also reductionists and are therefore not able to unlock the door of exclusion. Tonight, we will continue our search for an appropriate key to unlock the door in our next presentation, as we try to draw contours of a future perspective of mission among the Roma. I thank you for your attention.
We have a few minutes to take some questions and answers or comments that you might want to make. If you would please stand if you have something to say. You put up your hand so you can be recognized. Yes, please.
What language do the Roma speak? Or do they speak various different languages depending on where they live?
Many different languages. So it is they consist of many different groups, are named differently, many different languages. So it's a variety of people, but still there is the sense that you can still speak about one Roma people, but they are colorful in terms of languages among themselves. Thank you. Yes?
I believe this morning you said they were Indian.
Some
Can you tell us something about where they came from, the source, and how they wound up in where they are?
Many discussions have taken place as to what their origin is, but it seems now more and more there is consensus that they have come from India in the 14th century. Some state that it was because of the Islam that they had to flee, but it is still a lot of research is on the way, and people are really talking about it intensively. But some really are very strong on claiming that they are from India, and that is what binds all the different groups together. Yes? Another question? Yes?
I think it said something about an emerging witness among the Roma themselves. Is there a substantial number, not only in Hungary, but in other countries as well, where something is rising, their connection with the church is rising and growing, or something like that?
Well, as I said, it's quite different as far as I oversee the whole situation. It's very different to what's happening within the more traditional churches and what is happening among the Pentecostal churches. It seems that the Pentecostal churches are more flexible to relate to the Roma culture and are somehow easier can become the Jew a Jew and the Greek a Greek, the Roma a Roma. And that therefore, I mean, I'm very intrigued to learn more about the revival in France, in Spain, in Bulgaria, and of this study, the in-depth study on the situation in Bulgaria is both encouraging of what's happening, and I mean, it provides also, I think, a good model for the work among Roma in other countries. But of course, it's also the challenge how we, as more traditional churches, how we could respond or should respond, and that's an intriguing question. And I think we should dare to listen and sit down with the Roma and like what Burkhard is doing all the time.
Yeah. I think you also said this morning that you did meet some who were teachers, who are educated. So how does that happen? Do they go to the public schools, and is that a problem? Or how do they break into the middle class? How do they become educated if they're always roaming around?
I mean, we have the picture that they are always roaming around. In Hungary and many of the Central East European countries, they are settled. 80% of the 10 to 12 million Roma in Europe are settled, are not roaming around. So they have the possibility of attending school. And I know a number of people who have, I count them among my friends, a young Romanian Roma lady who studied law in Romania, is now on a scholarship in Heidelberg. I sense she's often pretty lonely, so we are in touch on Facebook, and I just poke her and pray for her. And I know another Romani, he is from Catholic background. He is now working on his 3rd PhD. It's just incredible. And then another one, he was a pastor in a church, a Pentecostal church. He has such a desire to study, and he has last half year, each morning 9 o'clock he was in the library and left at 5, and he was very eager, just studying from his own perspective as a pastor, so studying more about mission and what he could learn for the future of his church. And it's just fascinating to dialogue with him. So often we have this one particular image, but it's not the image, and I think that's the key problem, that we are operating on one or very few images which are pressed upon us by the media. Yes?
I remember in Holland we had a gypsy orchestra.
Oh yeah, Zigeunerorkest.
Still do, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, we have in Hungary we have we have the big gypsy orchestra as well. And maybe tonight I will show you a very fascinating DVD of a gypsy group of musicians from all over the place, all kind of different backgrounds, who travel through this country, making music all the time and asking each other questions. Oh, you're from India. What does it mean for you to be a Roma? Oh, you're from Spain. And it's very interesting to see their discussion and to see the vivid music. And it seems that music is also, apart from their origin, which really binds them together. And I think it's so good that we are dare to express our appreciation for parts of their culture. Yeah.
Do all Roma have the scriptures in their own language?
No. I have, one of my former students, Nora, is working on the translation of one of the Bible in one of the gypsy languages in the southern part of Hungary, in the Beas language. And some with the Wycliffe Bible translators. Someone else is working, I know very well, in Romania, translating the Bible into Gáspár dialect. But the problem is with translating the Bible that the gypsy languages are so fluid. So the moment you have translated them, it's already outdated. So it's a challenge. So and people are working on it. Yeah. Yes.
Would there be greater resistance in the villages to assimilation or integration maybe than in the urban areas?
I think there is a long tradition of forced assimilation under communism. And that is also, you should imagine that you as someone from Hungarian background are not anymore allowed to celebrate your Hungarian festival days and not to cook your special Hungarian dishes anymore, so that you are not allowed to live out your Hungarian cultural identity. Well, how would you feel? And that has been going on for many years under communism, that they were not allowed to express their Roma cultural identity. And therefore, often there is from the side of the Roma also suspicion towards the majority society, and kind of they themselves think of building a protective wall because of the experiences of the past. One more question, the last one. Yes, please.
The Presbyterians among us, Farrell puts out a letter to us. Hunter Farrell, how many of you get his letter? And he spoke in his July issue of Roma. And in his case, or in this letter, he's talking about how they're working in Russia. And evidently Dr. and Mrs. Burgess know Alan Smith, who are working in Russia, so we might get more information from them. I would like to think, as we look at missions over the years, we don't want the Roma people to go into the churches like the Chinese went into the churches, and we call them rice Christians. They only went into the churches to get food and jobs and whatever. But on the other hand, in China, we developed schools, and when the missionaries were forced out of China, it was the educated Chinese that became the leaders of first the underground church, and now the above ground church. So I think that as we look at missions, we have to rethink our responsibilities. Now, if we support the Smiths in their work with the Roma, we will know we've got somebody representing us over there. And then looking at the whole thing of education and so on. And you know, some people tell us that the world's going to hell in a handbasket. But isn't it interesting that not only is the leader of the Roma people, the leader of, was it Hungary? And he was a Roma. In India, one of the heads of government, I don't know whether he's prime minister or vice prime minister or what he is. Anyway, he was an untouchable. So we see somehow the churches are able to make a difference in their lives.
What I like very much now in your comments is to speak about the Roma and dealing with the Roma in a much broader context. Yes, each situation is different, and you cannot just use models of transplant models from one situation to another. But I'm, for instance, intrigued by what we can learn from the Indian situation and how they deal with the Dalit for dealing with the Roma. And therefore, this morning I presented this parallel with the African context, how in Africa there was a movement first, the European churches working towards civilization development, and then now the African churches were moving on into a stage of finding their own identity in African theology. Burkhard?
If you allow, just a short response to what you just said about the Presbyterian Church. I have a few documents from Presbyterian women who are also trying to support Roma, and I would like to put them someplace. I have only a few, I cannot give it to everyone, but you can see that you can go online and get more of that, what they are doing, and you mentioned that, the 10 days of prayer and other works.
You can stand back here and just hand them out to whoever wants.
Yeah, I have only samples, so that's people can look at them, but I have only a few.
But this brings about, sorry for my last, this brings about the importance that students start researching more in depth on what's happening in different situations at grassroots level, studying the newsletters of missionaries, interviewing them, trying to systematically study. I think there is a lot to be done, and beautiful stories will come out, I'm sure.